Okay, our next speaker is Farhana Sultana. She's a geographer at Syracuse University. Has worked for a variety of international organizations, NGOs, government agencies. She was an International Water Management Institute Fellow at the University of Minnesota, and she's a co-editor of the book, The Right to Water, Politics, Governance, and Social Struggles.
Hi, thanks to everyone who's still around, because I see a lot of students coming in and out. So I'm going to change and shift everyone's gaze a bit. We've been talking a lot about the science and the modeling and international perspectives. I'm going to really try to humanize it. I was asked to talk about, well, what do we mean by the social impacts of climate change and changing water patterns? So I'm going to really do a micro-scale analysis. But before I start to do that, let me just put it into some background and context. So how did I arrive at the analysis that I'm going to be presenting to you? So we discussed last night and pretty much throughout this morning and this afternoon that water issues, climate change, and all of the related things are complex, right? So complex issues require complex analysis. And I think what's really important, and this is particular to students who are still around, that these kinds of multidisciplinary conversations are important. And interdisciplinary understanding is really required for us to address these very complex interdisciplinary questions. So my perspective is informed by my own interdisciplinary training trajectory and experience. So the joke I was having last night was, well, there's a lot of geologists here. I'm a geologist too. I'm just an ex-geologist who happened to have worked at Princeton and GFDL. But then I became a geographer because I realized I love the Earth, but I like people on the Earth more. And then I went off and worked for the UN for a while and realized, okay, this is how policy works or doesn't. And then I decided to become an academic because this is where I get to do all of the things I want all of the time, and I have that academic freedom to do so. So what's driving this interest for me is that the compelling human component of what I saw, what I witnessed, what I researched. And so for nuanced social analysis, we really do need to have a more comprehensive appreciation of the complexities of this world. So I think that's where, for me, the real fascination lies. So we can have all the science and technology and all the models, but social processes and the challenges are effectively where the rubber meets the road. We can theorize, hypothesize, have models, have plans, projections, hypotheses, but things kind of fall apart, right, when it hits the ground, and people get involved. People are messy. We're very messy creatures. Adding to that, this is about climate change, and then we start to understand that, well, when we think about water as a social process, not just as a thing, but how water affects the way we organize as human beings, it really complicates issues even further. So we see that water seeps into everything, right? And it's a social issue, it's a political issue, economic, ecological, technological, scientific, and so on and so forth. I did not spiritual, but I should have, because it's a cultural and spiritual issue as well. So for me, water is the lens through which I look at these complex human-environment interactions and relations, and that's the kind of human narrative that I find very compelling that I'll try to share with you today. So on top of this, we have a messy society, we have messy water problems, and add the additional layer of complexities from climate change. This complicates what we know and what we don't know, and it disrupts what we think we know and what is even unknowable at this point, right? So again, it is gloomy and doomy, but not entirely. Because we can draw upon existing knowledge and research to inform us, to help us hypothesize better, to help us project better, to help us think about, well, what are the social implications of what might happen or may not, right? So the focus of my talk today is going to be the importance of gender and class analysis in the climate-water nexus in a rapidly changing world. So I will do social analysis, but I'm going to take it apart a little bit more and say, well, what is social? Who are we as humans, right? We're intersected by all these different axes of social difference. So I'll give you some case studies from my own research, and hopefully we'll be able to then ground a lot of different sets of disparate narratives in one place. So first, let me talk about the importance of water. Well, we know water is life. Without it, we can't survive. It's a non-substitutable resource. We can't drink oil. Unfortunately, that makes water a very important public or common good. And so just a couple of quotes for you. That thousands have lived without love, but not without water. That was from Auden. Then we had Ben Franklin's quote, which I think was quoted last night. When the well is dry, we learn the worth of water. And then Mark Twain said, whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting over. But lastly, my favorite one is from the United Nations from just a couple of years ago, which is the right to safe and clean drinking water and sanitation is a human right that is essential for the full enjoyment of life and all other human rights, right? So this, again, is effectively what Peter alluded to. It is almost legally binding. It's still controversial how you do it, but we've come to realize that water is one of those things that, as human earthling beings, we really can't live without. So bringing it back up to, okay, we know importance of water, but what do we think about in terms of water governance and climate change? Now, some of these issues were highlighted earlier throughout the day, right? We've talked about the increased frequency, intensity, and magnitude of weather events and ecological changes. I won't go into all of that because I think all of our science colleagues have done that quite well throughout the day. So we're seeing that greater variability and greater uncertainty. So already in a complex, messy social world, we have these added uncertainties that are being, compounding existing and potential problems. However, these are very place and context specific. So all the really, really cool graphs and images that you saw with all the nice colors showed you how it was different, right? Sea level doesn't change everywhere equally. Hurricanes and cyclones don't appear in the same place in the same way. So add to that the fact that there's social differences, there's ecological differences, and there's spatial differences in how we do things in even very small spatial scales. So there are two interlinked aspects regarding water that will have significant social implications, both directly and indirectly. I'll spell them out, then I'll go into each one of them a bit in greater detail. So the too much water problem, right? There's too much water where you don't want it. So basically, worsening of water-related hazards and disasters. So there's cyclones, hurricanes, storm surges, floods, riverbank erosion, inundation, sea level rise, and so much. So it's the problematic, wicked water that people wish didn't happen. Then compound with that is too little water, where you wish you had more safe water. So increasing water shortages or availability and the all-encompassing access to water crisis that we have talked about briefly, but I'll go into more detail. So this could be from water contamination, whether it's encroachment of salinity or some other pollutant, reduction in groundwater supplies, droughts, changes in rainfall patterns, then the accessibility issues, water governance crises in cities, so on and so forth. So we've got the too much water and the too little water. No one's fully happy with, the perfect type of water governance that we wish we had. We don't really have that anymore. So when we think about the social aspects of these water crises, and again, the images at the bottom are supposed to give away what I'm going to say, so test yourself. So in the too much water issue, so water-related hazards have gendered and classed impacts. So nearly 3 times more women compared to men died in the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami in South and Southeast Asia. So you have entire villages where there were no mothers. You have single fathers raising children because the mortality and morbidity rates amongst women were incredibly high, especially in places like Banda Aceh and Sri Lanka. So when we talk about vulnerable communities, we need to recognize that yes, it's a community, but no communities are homogeneous, right? So they're differentiated by gender and often further differentiated by class and race and age. So even if we think about an American example of Hurricane Katrina, you saw more women of color, poor black women in the lower Ninth Ward who really, really suffered compared to other women in other categories. Then if we look at the too little water problem, right? Water shortages and water crises have gendered implications too. Who do you think is fetching the water in majority of the world? Think about your great-great-great-grandmother. Think about Little House on the Prairie. Who's going to the well to haul the bucket? It's usually the women in almost every culture until we started to have tapped water, which is not very prevalent everywhere. So women are largely responsible for managing water in the home, and therefore drinking water crisis affects women and girls disproportionately. Girls are often asked to stay at home, not go to school, to help deal with the amount of water that's required for drinking and cooking and bathing purposes in the home. And then we see also health effects from the lack of water or exposure to contaminated water, which affects women's lives and livelihood opportunities in many parts of the global south. And when I mean by the global south, I mean most of South America, Africa, and Asia, right? The so-called third world. Controversial definitions, please look them up if you're really interested in what the difference is in the terminology. But basically in the so-called third world or developing world, we're seeing that amongst marginalized communities, the first group of people to bear the brunt of these water-related crises, whether it's too much water or too little water, are the women and usually the girls. So for all the hydrologists out there, these hydrological changes have significant social implications across social groups and communities. And for me, that's what compelled me to still be interested in hydrology and hydrogeology, but look at the human element further. So what do I mean by doing social analysis, and why do I think it's important for all of us, whether we're scientists, policymakers, politicians, planners, and so on? Because you know what? We live on Earth with people, and people are messy, as I said before. We can have very bad plans that are derived out of very weak social analysis. And I think the litany of very bad development planning that's happened in the last 60 years is testament to bad planning, which led to bad policy, which then had unforeseen and foreseen outcomes. Dams being one of them. Great, and then we realized the huge sociological and ecological impacts of dams. So if we look at, first let's look at the disasters and ecological shocks. So to do a social analysis in any situation of disasters would mean looking at the differential coping mechanisms and vulnerabilities. How do different groups of people cope? Who's responding and why are they responding that way? So for instance, I give you an example here. Again, I'm just going to go through this very quickly, but I'm happy to elaborate later. So why did so many mothers die in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia? Simple ability to swim, or rather inability to swim. So women often were holding on to children, not being able to climb up on the trees to survive, or were never taught to swim. So this does not mean go out and teach women just to swim, right? There are other issues involved, but yes, some of those basic skills were there. But often women were not leaving the home. They're taking care of the elderly. They're looking after the livestock, and they're hoping that the storm wouldn't come and wipe them away. But unfortunately, that explains some of those gender disparities we see in mortality and morbidity rates. A second point would be, the differential abilities to respond to and adapt to those kinds of changes that are happening. We're seeing those kinds of ecological shocks increasingly. And one of the gendered impacts is the distress selling often of women's assets. So when a family has lost everything to drought or to flood or inundation or erosion, what gets sold? Maybe the one little gold jewelry, a chain that the mother had as a wedding gift. Maybe some utensils or pots and pans. Those are distress sales, which then have a serious impact on women in many communities because that was probably their last asset. But that's often the first thing to go in order for this family to survive. So second issue that we have to look at if we're going to do good social analysis in this kind of complex climate change, water stress world is looking at those issues of access and control and management of resources. So who's doing what with what resource and why? So this gender division of labor is very common throughout the world. Men irrigate, women fetch domestic water. Or men will go off as fishermen into the high seas and, oops, you're right, too many buttons. Somebody said that this morning. So there is that kind of gender division of labor. And again, in parentheses, what I have here is triple burden that a lot of social scientists will say that women end up taking on the first primary burden of taking care of the home. Then often they're employed in some sort of wage labor, whether at a job or in their local community, so that's a double burden. Then looking after the whole community becomes a triple burden, right? To see if other families are taken care of, if food needs to be provided. So you see this kind of taking on of increasing types of labor during times of crisis or times of shortage. And then we also have to then recognize that gender doesn't exist just by itself. It's intersected with other axes of social difference. And what I mean by class, race, and age, so Queen Victoria is a white woman, but a poor woman in rural Appalachia is a poor white woman who is not the same as Queen Victoria. But what do they have in common? They're white and they're women, but they're not of the same class. This is what basic intersectionality analysis means. We need to do this very well in each community. Otherwise, we start to homogenize communities, which is doing a disservice. A third issue is looking at rights, responsibilities, and rewards. And this is a bit tricky because you need to kind of understand what's going on locally and the dynamics of different regions and different societies to really understand how to make sense of the complexities involved. So for instance, if you look at legal and or informal rewards and responsibilities or rights, so what we're seeing is there's a systematic inheritance bias. So often men will inherit land, but women won't, and that disadvantages them when different kinds of crises affect them, or if there's a, let's say, government redistribution effort, and they will look at who is the title holder of the household. So we see all sorts of complexities. I'm just throwing out a couple of examples just to set the context and how do we do this kind of analysis and how do we make sense of this. So we have to look at both the legal formal and then the informal, the unsaid, but what's the customary practices. And then we need to look at the differential capacities and capabilities. And what I mean by this is how do different people deal with what comes afterwards, whether it's too much water, too little water, or none at all, right? You've been completely displaced. How do people negotiate their right to a livelihood? How do they make sense of how to become economically engaged or socially not so marginalized? So there are many, many different ways that different households and different members of a household will respond and react to what's available to them. A fourth effect, and I think this is quite important, are paying attention to social norms and perceptions. And this is where the word patriarchy comes in, and many of you may be familiar with that. But patriarchy is as old as cavemen. It's the rule that dominates most of social organization. It's a rule of, well, the man should have the say, a woman's place is in the home. We're seeing some of that change in the US, but not so much, right? We're still seeing people talk about leaning in. Well, how do you balance children and careers and all of that other conversations in the US? So we need to understand that how in the developing world, notions of appropriate feminine behavior and appropriate masculine behavior are conditioned by local practices of patriarchy. Often religion is used to prop up all kinds of nonsense. And then you have the dutiful daughter and dutiful wife syndrome. Well, a good wife wouldn't do that, or a good daughter does this, right? And don't tell me it doesn't exist in the West. All of you who watch Downton Abbey know very well how fathers worry about marrying off their daughters, right? So the good daughter is the one that finds herself a husband. So we see all kinds of social norms and perceptions that influence or constrain what can and cannot be done. And that's why I have that second sub-bullet that says appropriateness, possibilities, and constraints. Because they exist in every society. Some issues are more poignant than others, but we need to pay attention to these issues to make sense of why people respond or adapt the way they do or the way they don't. A fifth issue is poverty and the livelihood resources and constraints that people may have or the opportunities they may have. So there could be constraints that are both, again, formal and informal. So maybe you're in a community, whether it's in Asia or Africa or Latin America, we need to understand how are people making a living? What do they aspire to? Are they living with cash transactions or maybe in kind, or are they chronically on credit and debt? So the multiple ways that everybody makes sense of their livelihood and their household economies. And then we need to also understand the multidimensionality and multi-causality of livelihood choices. So maybe you do raise goats and sheep on your farm, but then maybe you also knit some sweaters. Maybe you have a son who participates in a migratory job process and sends back remittances. Right? So there's every household diversifies its strategies of survival. So we need to pay attention to what's going on so that we can make sense of what people are likely to choose to do along with these changes. An important issue with this is what we're seeing is globally a feminization of poverty. We're seeing an increasing rise in female-headed households where the men have either left, maybe they've migrated somewhere else to work, or they've gone off to war, or they've died, but we're seeing increasing single-headed households, often led by mothers, and that puts an enormous strain on that entire family. A last point in social analysis and climate change research is to recognize that there's some really problematic literature out there that sees women as victims and as simultaneously as valorized agents. So yes, women are often the victims, but they don't always have the agency or the willpower or the political power and the resources to do the things that sometimes they're asked to do in very different projects. So we have these problematic stereotypes, and we have to be really, really careful about these stereotypes, right? Because gender implications and realities vary by context. You may have a matriarchal society, or you may have a society that places different importance to the elderly, the mother-in-law, the grandmother, than it does to the younger daughter-in-law, right? So there's all kinds of changes. And then we also need to pay attention to those issues of gendered exclusions and marginalizations and silencing in the very way we collect data in research and in planning and in implementation. Because the biggest problem I've come up against is, yeah, sure, we interviewed a woman. Done. Who did you talk to? The clan elder's wife. And she spoke for all the poor women everywhere in that whole region. Not really sure a clan elder's wife has the same experience of fetching water for miles. She probably has somebody else do that for her. So we need to understand that, that intersectionality issue, that we need to talk to ranges and groups of people to understand those complexities. And then at the same time, look at the huge bodies of literature in the social sciences and in policy to not romanticize these terms of community and participation and empowerment. You have no idea how problematically these are bandied around, especially in climate change literature, and the community will participate and people will be empowered to be resilient. Wow, that's a mouthful of buzzwords. What does that mean? But we see that all the time. So again, I'm trying to problematize and ask us to do better jobs. So when I say, well, what does gendering climate change mean? Right, and here again, a couple of photos, and the first one is from the Bali COP in 2007, and the bottom one is a strange picture used at the UN that says it's up to UN now, or maybe it's up to you now, however you want to interpret it. So in the Bali COP 2007, it was the first time where you had a lot of scholars and practitioners and activists who actually said, we can't have climate justice without gender justice, that we can't talk about adaptation and climate resiliency unless we start to pay attention to the issue of gender, and I would say, and race and class. So what they argued is that we need to have better gender disaggregated data and focus. That's really been lacking in international climate change debates and in national discourses. So for instance, the NAPA is a National Adaptation Plan of Action that every country is supposed to draft, and many countries have. You do see a complete, no attention to those kinds of social complexities that end up confounding whatever they implement. A second aspect of gender and climate change means looking at those implications that I just talked about, the rates at which women and girls are disproportionately at risk or vulnerable or made vulnerable or impacted compared to men and boys in their own society. So we need to understand those processes as well as understand the data. And then again, do very nuanced intersectional analysis that makes sense in that context. So maybe in a context of a similar ethnicity group, race analysis is not important, but class analysis is. In Katrina, race analysis was very relevant and important, right? But it may not be in every context. So we need to understand how these other social axes of difference become relevant, become poignant, right? Become important for this messy social world we live in. And then we need to really understand, and this is what a lot of the more recent literature has been highlighting, that the multiple knock-on effects from these socio-ecological changes. So whether it's infrastructural damage or livelihood loss or crop failures or out-migration. And all of these issues that are driven by climate change, water stress, again, play out in each household and in each community in very gendered ways. And then it also means paying attention to those very unequal power relations within society, paying attention to who's poor, who's not. How is poverty playing out? Is it institutional? Is it driven by different historical legacies of different groups not getting along together? Is it a certain form of feudal exploitation? There are lots of different ways that we need to do better social analysis to be able to implement better climate change policies. So we need to then understand how those climate change disruptions or impacts, right, add another variable to an already complex, messy, variable situation. And then this last point in what does gender and climate change mean, before I go into my two empirical examples, is, well, we're seeing a real flurry of adaptation projects and adaptation funding. Well, what does that mean? We need to do a better job of asking and critically investigate, well, who's doing the adapting, where are they doing it, how are they doing it, why, and with what means? Whose laws are they following? Whose guidelines? And is it locally, socially, politically, culturally, ecologically really relevant? Because maybe it's not. What's relevant, 10,000 miles away may not be relevant here. So we need to basically understand that adaptation is not just technical or infrastructural, but it's very much a social process. We can build the Dutch dikes or the embankments and the seawalls, but how people respond to them, how they look after them, how they then adapt their lifestyles and livelihoods, it's a very social process. And then we need to understand the non-linearity and complexities, and I think a lot of our good scientist colleagues pointed that out to us all day, but we need to understand the non-linearity and complexities in the social systems, not just in the climate systems. And then recognize the variations across sites and scales. And what I mean by this is there's great variation in fairly short physical distances, because the agroecology could be very different there, right? And then also across scales. What may make sense at a micro scale may not make sense at a mesoscale or a regional scale. So we need to have that kind of flexible planning, that adaptive planning process. And then, of course, again, to bring it down to the human level, we need to pay attention to the local politics, to local power relations, and the adaptation possibilities. So if hydroponics and caged fish aquaculture makes sense, great. But what if nobody there is used to caged fish aquaculture and nobody wants to do it? And it's not going to really make a lot of sense. You may implement it, go away, use up a lot of donor money, and then realize that it didn't really take hold. So it wasn't really a socially sustainable project to begin with. And again, to drive home a point that I've already repeated many times, pay attention to those gendered norms, regimes, and practices that influence the very adaptation projects that are being implemented in the name of the poor, or often in the name of climate change resiliency. And then we need to pay attention to that adaptation can actually exacerbate, right, and change and alter vulnerabilities. And I think an example was given that if New York built a huge seawall, Connecticut shores would get flooded, right? So we need to understand how we can externalize those kinds of impacts, or rather how it can also come back in an indirect way to affect people. So I'm going to give two quick empirical examples from my research. And again, I'm going to go fairly quickly in the interest of time, but I'm happy to elaborate. So again, they're going back to the first 2 points I made. Too much water, too little water. Right, so the first one's called climate change impacts and looking at gender and class. What does it mean? So all this stuff that I've said that may sound very vague and obtuse, I'm going to ground it through an example. And then the second one would be about adaptation strategies and how does gender and class become relevant there. So the first one is looking at tropical cyclones, storm surges, and their gendered impacts. So we've learned that tropical cyclones vary across different bays and oceans and estuaries. So one of the places in the world where very, very violent cyclones happen is in the Bay of Bengal, part of the Indian Ocean. And as you can see in the bottom map on the bottom left, historically, they have a tendency to come up the Indian Ocean and swing right. That's because this is a 90-degree angle shoreline as a way to kind of focus and channel both the cyclonic storm and then also the height of the storm surge. And I've just given a couple of storm tracks. Now what's interesting, a point that was made earlier, that how these kinds of disruptive weather-related events can lead to political change. This one led to Bangladesh going to war with Pakistan and becoming independent in 1971. It was a colony of Pakistan. It was called East Pakistan until 1971. The cyclone in 1970, where the mothership, aka current-day Pakistan, did not pay attention, really led to that kind of uprising. So yes, disasters do bring about change. This one, 1991, 150,000 people died. It came without warning. It was a huge storm surge, and it just flattened and went up the estuary and up the rivers. And don't forget, this is one of the most active deltas in the world. You've got the Ganges River coming from the Himalayas there. You've got the Brahmaputra coming through the Himalayas over there. You've got two massive rivers with huge sediment loads and a huge subsidence rate. And they peak at different times, and you've got this nasty water coming up, and they have nowhere to go. This one, in 2007, not such a huge human casualty, but more property damage. So therein lies the paradox of what development means, right? So in the West, you don't have such human casualties, but in the global South, you usually have huge human casualties until people start to have better warning systems, evacuation routes, but then you have more property because people have slightly better infrastructure now. So what do I mean by doing a gender and class analysis? So what we saw is that in each of these disasters, again, higher proportion of women in terms of mortality and morbidity rates, more girls than boys. A lot of the women stayed back to look after their goats and cows and chickens. They did not go, they didn't evacuate because they didn't want their meager belongings to be looted. So there was real class and gender issues there. It's a very complex human tragedy story, so I won't go into that. But then you also have a gender issue in relief. So here, from helicopters, aid is being dropped off to people, but you see, people fighting and jostling, and often it's the men, and not necessarily the women who are often the female-headed households. A second issue is even those infrastructure, like these cyclone evacuation shelters have been built, right? It's supposed to be about 20 feet high, so if you get a 20 feet high storm surge, but they're just one big room. So for all sorts of patriarchal and cultural norms, a lot of women did not want to be packed in a room with a bunch of men, and there were no separate toilet facilities. So again, we see in good intentions gone awry, where a lot of women were not going to these cyclone shelters because there were incidences of harassment and rape and people feeling uncomfortable. So we see a disaster and a tragedy just compounding on itself. So there's all sorts of dynamics that go into the making of a disaster, right? So a cyclone is a hazard. A cyclone is a disaster where people are involved. And it's a gender disaster when there's more women suffering at various stages before, during, and after compared to men, that it makes it a more gender disaster. So the second case study related to this, but the first one basically that I just showed you was, well, with climate change, we're going to see increasingly stronger cyclones and higher storm surges, so we're likely to see other forms of human tragedies. And in the second case study, which is again from the Bay of Bengal, but looking at how are people responding to increasing sea level. Now you can, geologists can argue with me about how much of this is the actual mean sea level versus how much of it is subsidence. We can go into that detail later, but the important thing is the mean sea level has been rising. There has been a huge amount of saltwater intrusion into freshwater sources in both the shallow and the deep aquifers and into the estuaries. So what you're seeing is people are responding by trying to make a livelihood in a very harsh saline waterscape. So this is a place of the largest mangrove forests in the world, the Sundarban mangrove forest. These are trees that can survive in brackish water, which is here. More and more of these mangrove forests are being cut down. They're actually dying away too because of too much salt, right? Not enough fresh water. And more of these are being cut down and being turned into shrimp ponds. And this is where class analysis becomes important because wealthier people are flooding the rice paddy fields of poorer farmers, making them saline, then the rice can't grow, and then the poor farmer is kind of dispossessed of his land, sells it off to the richer guy, who then grows shrimp because North America and Western Europe loves shrimp cocktails. So, a lot of shrimp growth. You can say, well, there you go, adaptive livelihood. Well, not so much if we do a gender analysis. Because who's the cheap labor in these shrimp farms? It's women and girls who stand for hours in waist-deep, neck-deep water, catching the small shrimp fry. So they become part of that global industry of underpaid, devalued labor, who then has to carry some of the burdens of standing in seawater all day, so illnesses and all of that, but not having a diversified livelihood base, right? They can only work for the shrimp farm or they have to migrate into the cities. And there are also instances of harassment of women, and not enough fresh water. So again, they're walking further to get fresh water for their families. So all kinds of things are coming to a head in both their increasing sea level rise and then how people are responding to that in terms of livelihood strategy. So while some folks may see this as a good adaptation reality, if you really do that kind of micro level human analysis, not so much. So I'm going to conclude, basically kind of draw together all the things that I've said, and I know some of it was abstract, but some of it hopefully was humanized, that when we think about climate change, we need to understand that climate change will impact social relations, and primarily through changes in water, both directly and indirectly, and in the two ways, right? Too much water, too little water. So water-related disasters and water scarcity or water availability. So what we need to do basically is recognize this first. First of all is awareness and a recognition, and then address the ways that water unavailability and inequality and maldistribution can challenge fulfillment of broader development goals, and therefore we need to heed the opportunities and the constraints that exist. Because at the end of the day, water does everything, right? Or it doesn't do anything at all. It doesn't let you do what you want. So in many ways, we're seeing climate change and the effects it has on water base, whether through storms or lack thereof, or lack of fresh water, is bumping up against broader development goals, broader societal goals, and it's definitely affecting different groups of people in different ways. So the second point that I think is really important is to recognize that climate change and social implications are not gender neutral. I think I've probably driven that nail on the coffin a lot, and hopefully all of you will go out of here being really great feminist scholars. But recognize that social analysis isn't just say, I did social analysis, I spoke to a person. That doesn't work. And when we do that kind of close gender or class or race analysis, it means we need to address the lack of attention to class and gender data. We really need to have more disaggregated data and pay attention to the issues or highlight the issues when they're not being highlighted in both international and national level or even regional level climate change debates. A third thing is examine the multiplicity of environment development issues in any given context. Because the way water seeps through the ground and in lakes and so on and so forth, there's always going to be a host of water-related environment development challenges, whether it's crop failure, ecosystems dying out, or water showing up where there was no water before and people are responding to it in different ways. So we need to therefore look at those much more human and development and social progress issues around unequal power relations, poverty, and social marginalization that interplay with climate change disruptions and the so-called adaptation projects, right? So it's doing social analysis to processes that are influenced by climate change, but also projects that are being implemented to address climate change. And then what the second part of this is really, really pay attention to the outcomes of water-related changes. And again, I think I've driven that pony to the ground. I think that's probably the wrong way to say it. But what I mean is pay attention to the really, really complex but very, very important ways that we're seeing increasing presence of the complexities of water resource management decisions play out in the human world. Another issue is, and this is, I think, one of the hardest things to do, especially for planners and policymakers, is to look at the contextual linkages between poverty, social justice, and gender concerns in creating climate-resilient societies. This is kind of where most of the governments of the developing world are at. They're trying to figure out how do we do better development that is more climate resilient. Well, if you weren't doing very good development to begin with, maybe this is your opportunity to do it better and then to pay attention to the things you weren't paying attention to. And if you want to call that climate resilient, that's great. But if it's more equitable and, you know, pays attention to issues of social justice, I think all of us would like our governments to do that, right? So what this basically means is for whether it's local planning people, you know, small scale, large scale, regional scale, is paying careful attention to the structural inequalities and power relations in resource management, not just in society in some abstract way, but how do different groups of people manage different resources, you know, across sites and scales? So do they have control over something? Do they have user rights? Do they have access rights? Are they part of a more deliberative and participatory planning process? So this kind of comes back to development as a whole. And then we need to also integrate very different perceptions and experiences and abilities, as I mentioned earlier. And then we need to also, again, not to just leave you with doom and gloom, but what are some positive things that are happening? People are increasingly paying attention to strengthening social networks, to alternative livelihood strategies, and to information sharing. This is how we are beginning the conversation, and we are beginning to see some change, because at the end of the day, we are, one human society that we have on this one planet Earth, and there's always going to be some inequities, but we can try to do it better, right? So this is my last slide, and I'm going to conclude that, in my opinion, water is a human right, and climate disruptions will challenge fulfilling basic rights of the poor globally. So whether we think about it as too much water, too little water, we need to contextualize it that at the end of the day, it is about having meaningful lives, about having a life with dignity. And these are just a couple of images about how water may be in the future, right? Being transported through armed guards, and you've got a picture of the mother under an open tap, and that's just the cover of the book that was mentioned when I was being introduced, looking at the right to water. It came out last year. Thank you.